I came across this article. Ronald Pinkerton is a hang glider. He's a pilot as well, but he's a hang glider, and he describes an incident that he once had as a hang glider. After launching his glider into the air, a strong updraft carried him more than 4,200 feet in the air. And so then he began slowly, calmly descending through the air again. And as he was descending, he was suddenly hit by a powerful new current that sent him in the opposite direction, plummeting toward the ground. He said, "I was falling at an alarming rate. Trapped in an airborne riptide, I was going to crash. Then I saw him, a red-tailed hawk. He was 6 feet off my right wingtip, fighting the same gust I was. I looked down. The ground was rushing up at me. I looked at the hawk again. Suddenly, he banked and flew straight downwind. Downwind! It seemed like the hawk was committing suicide. And suddenly, the thought entered my mind, follow the hawk. It went against everything I know about flying, but now all my knowledge was useless. I was at the mercy of the wind, and so I followed the hawk. 100 feet above the ground, suddenly the hawk gained altitude. For a split second, I seemed to be suspended, motionless in space, and then a warm surge of air pushed the glider upward. I was stunned. Nothing I knew as a pilot could explain this phenomenon, but I was rising." Now, we are wrapping up this series that we've been looking at, that I've titled All In today, and we've been looking at this question of how do you become a person who is all in? That is, a person who loves God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. And we've been looking at these practices like prayer and scripture reading and worship and fellowship, which are the ways that you and I fly normally in terms of our spiritual life. Because we generally believe that our spiritual development is through an intentional process. We have to enter into these intentional practices in order for our spiritual lives to develop. You can change over time into the person that God intended you to be. And because that's true, we could also get lulled into this idea that it is not until you are ready that God will ask you to do something. And that, I'm afraid, couldn't be further from the truth. Sometimes you just have to follow God into something, like Pinkerton followed that red-tailed hawk. It doesn't make any sense. It goes against everything that you've experienced up to this point, and you just have to go for it. You're fine in your relationship with God. You're content with where you're at, and then that unexpected appointment with God happens. And that's sort of what happened to Abram in Genesis chapter 12. When God called to Abram, he said, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And there are some of you that are in that age bracket, and you're thinking, my time for ministry is done. You think so? Abram was just getting started at 75. Abram received a call from God who said, "It's time, Abram, go." It was fast. His transition didn't take any time at all. Today, he's living in the land that his father moved into, maybe that he lived in for decades. He's 75 years old, doing what he did every day, and then he's not. Because if you meet God face to face, it changes your mission. It does. If you meet God as he really is, and this is what we see in so many stories in the Scripture, whenever you get a grip on who God really is, And sometimes God gives you this huge download all at once. Sometimes it's over time, but sometimes it's a huge download all at once. That new knowledge and that experience of who God is sends you out. It pushes you out. In fact, the word that we use for mission actually comes from the Latin word missio, which means sent. So Abram is sent in Genesis 12 to a land God would show him. That became his mission. Now, we don't know the relationship that Abram had with God before that because the narrative picks up with Abram at 75. But clearly he believed in God. But that belief isn't what sent him on mission. What started his mission is that God chose him. There's nothing in the introduction of the story saying something like, God saw that Abram was worthy, that he was righteous and just, or God saw that he was a man after God's own heart, like we see with David. Nope, just this sudden call. God chose Abram. It's actually how we see God working throughout Scripture, and it's what we see in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. If you belong to God, you are one of his people, which means you are a chosen people. That's what it says on the screen. In other words, you are God's special people. You're a royal priesthood, says Peter there. You're a holy nation, which means that you're set apart. And all of that is what puts you on a mission, which is what we see in the second half of the verse, that you may proclaim him who chose you. Now, it's all well and good to say you're all in. It's all well and good to say that, but you have to recognize that there is a purpose to being all in. It isn't just so that you can sit and soak. It puts you on mission. Abram was a chosen people. We would call that a calling in our modern sensibilities because we don't want anybody to think that we think that we're special. So we don't say we're chosen. We say we are called. See how we get around that? That choosing to us seems like it might make us arrogant. But choosing really should have the opposite effect for us. If God has chosen us, then that should be the dismantling of our consumer mentality, the what's in it for me sort of mentality. See, meeting God in a direct fashion immediately turns you into a man or woman on mission. You're no longer motivated by, what do I get out of this? That's not even a primary consideration for you. And that's often what we ask when we talk about the spiritual practices like prayer and worship and fellowship and all of those kinds of things. What am I going to get out of it if I practice those things? But meeting God face to face always sends you out, just as it literally does here for Abram and Sarah and Lot. Abram doesn't question, he doesn't ask what's in it for me. He doesn't do the pros and cons balance sheet. If I stay here, this is what I'll experience. But if I go, this might be the benefit for me. This is Abram's situation. He grew up in a certain context. He had faith in God. And then God says, you're mine, go. No warning, just a sudden downdraft in his life. And God comes and says, go, and Abram is just like, okay. Where exactly am I going? Just start walking. I'll tell you when you get there. Get out of that familiar geography, get out of the familiar culture, get out of the places where you're prominent and comfortable, get out of your safety zone, Abram. Take a risk. Make great moves. Go. And like many curious onlookers of the biblical account, you might be saying, okay, this is a story about Abraham. I mean, that's just for him. No. It's not just Abraham. It happens over and over and over in Scripture. Take Moses. Like Abraham, Moses believed in God. He trusted God. But where was the first time that he met God face to face? Well, it's Exodus chapter 3 at the burning bush. Almost immediately upon Moses being confronted with the grandeur and holiness of God, God says, "Go, Moses, go get my people." Well, okay, that's the Old Testament. I mean, this doesn't really apply to us today, does it? Okay, well, let's take a look at Peter. Where's Peter's confrontation with a very real God? In Luke chapter 5. Peter's been out fishing all night. The nets come in empty every single time they draw them in. And so they're sailing back to shore. Jesus comes walking along the shore and he's like, "Hey, how'd you do?" Peter says, "All the fish went deep. Our nets are empty." And Jesus is like, "It's probably because you put your nets in on the wrong side of the boat. Why don't you go back out and try it again?" And Peter's like, "This is ridiculous. I mean, the fish already went deep. If you know anything about fishing, if they're already deep, the light of day just keeps them there. They're not coming up in the light of day. They're staying deep." And Peter's like, "There's nothing out there. The nets are empty. What are we doing?" "Just try." "Okay, this is stupid, but I'll try it." And they do it, and they get this huge catch of fish. You know the story, like the boat begins to sink. There's so much fish. What does Peter do? He throws himself at the feet of Jesus. "I'm a sinful man. Get away from me." It's the first time that he sees Jesus for who he really is. And what does Jesus say? "Do not be afraid. From now on, you're going to fish for men." Which is just a New Testament version of "go to a land that I send you to." That's all it is. It's mission. Immediately, Jesus is giving Peter mission. Every time someone meets God face to face and really sees God, it pushes them out into mission. Paul is on the road to Damascus. He meets Jesus physically on the road, and Jesus says, "Stop what you were doing, and I'll show you what you are going to do from now on." Mission. Paul was quite familiar with mission. He was a man on a mission. And yet God confronts him directly and says, "Nope, that whole mission's out. You're into a new whole phase of life." You see, God providing a mission isn't something for people who don't know what to do with their life. Not me. I'm in a career. I'm set. I already know what I'm supposed to be doing. Yeah, so did Paul. And God says, "Nope, I'm going to change it for you." It often comes to people who have things completely figured out in terms of their goals and their desires. I am quite certain that Abram would have been quite happy in Haran. But God came and he showed himself to Paul, he showed himself to Abram, and with that revelation came this whole new driving purpose in Paul's life and in everybody else's life that meets God to point them forward into a new purpose. Let me give you one more example. And we know we're pretty familiar with Isaiah. And Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah is a prophet. He knows God. And suddenly in Isaiah 6, he's confronted with a vision of the throne room, and the Lord is high and lifted up, and Isaiah is overwhelmed. He falls down and he says, "Woe is me, for I am undone." And for the first time, Isaiah sees the grandeur of God. The first time he sees the glory of who God is, high and exalted. And immediately God says, "Who shall I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah is already changed. He lifts up his hand and he says, "Here I am. Send me." See, every time when there's a direct confrontation with God, every time somebody sees God for who he is, they lose that consumer mentality. They stop asking, "What's in it for me?" And they say, "I will risk, I'll sacrifice, I'll go, I'll do whatever it takes to serve those people, to meet their needs in the name of Christ." This is what it is to be all in.